So for this session, we will talk about Excel functions and formulas. Last meeting, we discussed about your basics of Excel and your preliminaries. We discussed about your role of IT, the common business functions, your Excel screen, cell referencing, functions, and formulas. For this afternoon, or for this session, we will dwell much about Excel functions and formulas. So let's start. Function. So what is a function again? Last meeting, we already defined what is a function, but let's reiterate the definition of a function. A function is a preset formula. If you still remember, in your Excel screen, we have there your formula bar. So in this formula bar, you can either place here a text or a value, and your value can be in the form of a function. So there are different functions available. If you remember also, we discussed different functions such as your math function, your logical function, your lookup and reference function, your trig function, and etc. So some functions are simple, such as sum function, and there are complex functions. Normally, complex functions are denominated, or functions are denominated in a parenthesis, and a complex function contains several arguments. So from one parenthesis or one argument, we have a complex, or we can have a complex function which contains several arguments. Let's now discuss and look into your common financial functions. The first common financial function that we will discuss is the FV, or your future value. So what is your future value? Using the future value function, of course, it calculates the future value of an investment. So you learned already how to compute a future value based on your calculator, but here you try to compute a future value using your Excel file. But what are the datas that you need to compute for the future value? To compute for your future value, you need your periodic, your constant payments, and your constant interest rate. So your periodic talks about the number of periods. Constant payment talks about your periodic payments. And lastly, your interest rate talks about your interest, or your I. So as long as you have the following data, you can already compute for your future value. Next common financial function is your IPMT, or your interest payment. In your interest payment, of course, it calculates the interest payment for a specified period of time with constant periodic payments and a constant interest rate. So what you compute now is not the future value of an investment, but the interest payment, or the amount of interest you will pay. So what are the datas that you need? Again, the period or the number of period, the constant periodic payment or the periodic payments, and then we have your constant interest rate or your interest rate. Next, we have your IRR. IRR, or your internal rate of return. Sometimes you know this as your effective interest rate. Normally, what we do in your effective interest rate is that we compute it using your trial and error method. So if you still remember in your intermediate accounting one, you try to compute for the effective interest rate of a note or effective interest rate of an investment. So to facilitate the easier computation of your IRR, your effective interest rate, we can make use of our Excel. So how do we compute? First, we calculate the internal rate of return using the interest rate received from an investment, and we use your negative values and your positive values. So what are these negative values and your positive values? If you still remember, we use a higher rate and a lower rate. And based on this higher rate and lower rate, we get the present value using the higher rate and the present value using your lower rate. And then we can compute for the difference. We either add or subtract that difference to our base rate to compute for our effective interest rate. So that is also what is used by Excel. So we use a negative and a positive value to compute for your internal rate of return. Next, we have your NPV. So what is your NPV financial function? We know this one as your net present value. So in accounting, how do we compute for your net present value? A net present value is computed as present value of cash inflow less present value of cash outflow. And this is your net present value. So under your Excel, NPV works by calculating the net present value of investment by using a discount rate and a series of future payments and income positive values. So we have here two values again. We have your future payments or your negative values, and then we have your income or your positive values. So your future payments or negative values is your cash outflows. And your income or positive values are your cash inflows. And then Excel automatically computes for your net present value. Sir, what is the use of your net present value? Generally, we make use of a net present value to determine if ever a project or an investment is viable. So if we have a positive net present value, of course, a project or investment is viable. Also, internal rate of return. If we have a higher internal rate of return, of course, we could pursue that project. Next, we have your payment or PMT. So what is the payment function? Your payment function calculates the payment for a loan based on a constant payment and a constant interest rate. So what's the difference between IPMT and PMT? In your IPMT, what is computed is the amount of your future interest payment, while your PMT talks about your monthly payment or your amortization. So what are the items that you need to consider to compute for your payment? We have your constant payments and your constant interest rate. Next, the function PV or present value. Of course, the function PV computes for the present value of a particular investment, using again a particular period, payment, and interest rate. And lastly, we have your rate, which now computes for your interest rate. Normally, this interest rate is known as your coupon or the actual rate, while your EIR is your effective interest rate or your market rate. So using a rate, we can compute the interest rate per period of an annuity. Normally, fair value interest payment, PV rate, and IRR are used in your loans, whether these are receivables, loan receivable, or a loan payable. Furthermore, you can also make use to compute for the amount of your investment. And NPV and IRR is of course used to determine whether a project is viable. So these are common financial functions that we have in Excel. Next, we have your common logical functions. So what are the common logical functions in Excel? First, we have your AND function. What's the use of an AND function? It checks whether all arguments are true. And if all arguments are true, it will present true. Take note, what is checked here are all arguments. You already determined what is an argument generally. One item in a formula or one item under your formula is an argument. So based on those different arguments, we determine if ever all those arguments are true. Next, we have your false. So it returns logical value false if ever the value is false. Next, if checks whether a condition is met. Here we have a condition. So based on a condition, it returns a true value and a false value. So take note, it returns a true value and a false value. It does not return true, it does not return false, but it returns a value in lieu of true and in lieu of false. So returns one value if true, returns one value if false. So for example, if A1 is equal to 10, it returns a value if ever it is true. Let's say our value is yes. So that is the value true. If that is false, it returns another value. So let's say it returns a value no. So these are the values returned, not the true or false itself. Clear? In and false, what is returned are true and false. But in if, it returns a value based on the condition. Next, we have an if error. So returns value if error if expression is an error and the value of the expression itself if it is correct. So again, based on the expression you provided in your function, it presents value if error if it is an error. If not, it presents the expression itself or the value of that expression. Next, we have not. In not, what happens here is the other way around. So in your and false, here in and it presents true, in false it represents false. But in not, what happened is if it is false, it presents true. If it is true, it presents false. So it provides the other value around. Next, the value or the logical function or. So here, it checks whether any of the arguments are true and returns true or false. And it returns false only if all arguments are false. So what happens in an or? Remember, so if one is true, one or more is true, if all is false. If one or more is true, what happens? It returns true or false. But if all is false, what happens? It returns false. Take note of the differences. And false, including not. What is the difference of and false and not? And false, it represents the value itself. But in not, it represents the other way around. Next, we have true. It returns the value true. It returns the value true. Okay, so those are the common logical functions. As we said before in our last session, we will only discuss the common functions that are usable here in our subject AE21. After discussing functions, we go now to your formulas. So generally, what we place in a formula or in a formula, you have already know, we can either place there a text or a value, or of course, a function. So what if there is an error in that formula? So we call those formula errors. So when can there be a formula error? There is a formula error if the Excel cannot calculate the item you place in the formula. So remember, here in a formula bar, you place there your formula. If ever Excel cannot calculate that formula, then we have a formula error. So what are the common reasons for a formula error? The first error is, one reason is an incorrectly written formula. So when can we say there is an incorrectly written formula? One example is that criteria or expression is incomplete. So for example, based on your formulas, you should have placed their different criterias, but you miss one criteria. Therefore, the formula is incorrect. Another is misspelled functions. Misspelled functions. So when do we have a misspelled function? So for example, the name of the function is concatenate, but you misspelled it. Therefore, there is a formula error. Another reason for formula error is incorrect referencing. We have already discussed how to properly reference whether that is a cell to another worksheet or to another Excel file. Next reason for a formula error is that the fundamental of mathematics are not properly met. So there is an incorrect mathematical fundamentals. Breaking mathematic fundamentals. So those are reasons for formula errors. Now, after having an idea on what is a formula error, let's discuss different formula errors. So let's start first with your multiple pound sign error. So when do we have a multiple pound sign error? There is a multiple pound sign error if the cell contains if the column contains data that is not enough to fit that cell. So for example, the amount placed is 1 million. However, your cell is only like this. The width of the cell is only like this. So the width is not enough to cater the data to be placed on that cell. So it cannot display the whole 1 billion. It only can display some. Therefore, it will contain a multiple pound sign error. So it will show multiple pound sign. So 4. Next error is the name error. So what is the name error? Name error appears when it doesn't recognize the text entered in a formula. So if ever, for example, you place a function there, but that function is incorrectly placed and Excel cannot recognize that, it will show a name error. So how do you check a name error? You check it through error checking. So how do you do error checking? So to do error checking, first click the name error. Okay, so we click the name error, and then next, go to Formulas tab. Next, click Check Error or Error Checking. Click Check Error or Error Checking. 4, you can already edit or help. You can choose from the different choices here in the pop-up menu, whether you want help, you show calculation steps, or you ignore the error, or you edit the error. And then 5th, you can now edit the error. 6, you complete the checking. Okay? So if you just want to check the error, so you can ask for a help on the error itself through Excel. Okay, so how do you do that? You click the error, go to Formulas tab, you click Error Checking or Check Error, and then you can now click any of the following in the pop-up menu. So that is how we check the name error. Next, value error. Value error appears when a mathematical formula references a text entry instead of a numerical entry. So here, there must be a cell reference. So for example, under your A1, what is placed there is name Tamayaw. And then you place in one formula, let's say you place under cell C5, A1 divided by 12. So A1 here is the relative reference. So in short, there is a cell reference, but we will divide it to 12. Can you divide a text to 12? Can you divide Tamayaw to 12? No. Therefore, there will be a value error because instead of A1 being a number, what is placed is a text. So what we need here is a number, but we place text. So to check this formula, we can use trace precedence to display arrows that show cells which affect the selected cell. How to check? Trace precedence. To check, we use trace precedence. Okay. So how do we trace that? So this is how we do it. First, you need to click the error. So since our error is value, we click that. Again, we go to formula tabs. And then on your formula tabs, you click trace precedence. So click trace precedence. And then, as you can see, it will show you your precedence. So there will be an arrow that will show the precedence. So based on the arrow, what are our precedents? So 1, 2, 3, 4. So this is known as cell A5, cell B5, C5, and D5. So those are your precedents. Since there is a value error, meaning we have selected a text instead of a value or number. So as you can see, A5 is a text. So what is our error? A5. So we need to remove A5. Okay? So after that, you can now check the error, which is the removal of A5, and then click check to complete the correction of the formula. Okay? That is your value error. Next, we have your div0 error. So when do we have a div0 error? We have a div0 error if ever we divide a number by 0. So normally in Excel, the division of a number by 0 happens when it refers to a blank cell as a divisor. That's why it's div0, because you are dividing it to 0 or a blank cell. That is our div0 error. Next, we have your ref error. So what is a ref error? Ref error appears when a cell reference isn't valid. You'll see this error frequently whenever a cell range that was referenced in a formula is deleted. So this happens if there is an error in a particular reference. So error in referencing, whether that is a reference from a cell or worksheet or from another workbook. So those are the reasons on your ref error. So what again are your different errors? So the first error is the multiple pound sign error. When do we have this error? If ever the width of the cell is not enough. Next error, we have your name error. Name error, if ever Excel doesn't recognize the text entered into the formula. How to check this? You can check this one using error checking. Next, we also have your value error. When do we have a value error again? If ever there is a reference to a text instead of number. Another error, we have your div0 error. Div0 happens if ever we have a divisor of 0 or a blank cell. Another error is your ref error. This happens if you have an incorrect reference. What's the difference between a value error and a ref error? In a value error, remember, we have other correct references, while in your ref error, it is purely an incorrect reference. Okay? In your value, we have other correct reference such that one reference or some reference pertains only to text, which should have been number. But in reference error, purely the reference is wrong. So those are the different basic functions and formula basics or different errors we can encounter in a formula.